Haisai Gusio, hello everyone. Welcome back to Ichariba 𝕍𝕠𝕚, an Okinawan Voices and Stories podcast. This is episode 3, part 2 on Hajichi. If you haven't listened to the part 1 episode, we will provide a link in our show notes. In this podcast, we aim to create an open and safe learning and growing space where we will explore alongside our guest speakers what it means to be 𝕍𝕏𝕚𝕤. Our intention and prayer for this project is to cultivate our knowledge about our histories, celebrate the amazingly diverse and resilient cultures of our people, inspire other 𝕍𝕏𝕚𝕤 of all generations and geographic locations to be curious about their histories, and to preserve those precious pieces of our identity for future generations. And of course, to have fun along the way. We'll laugh, we'll cry, we'll stumble around and be human. We hope you will join us for this evolving journey together. We're looking forward to it. Yuta sarugutu unige sabida.
And welcome back to part 2 of this engaging dialogue on Hajichi. 𝕚𝕚 Mariko. My name is Mariko, and I will be your co-host again this episode. In part 1 of this topic, we were joined by Hilson Reedpath, 𝕍 Lewis, and June Owatari, as we took a look backwards in time at the historical components of Hajichi. For our episode today, I'm delighted to welcome back 𝕍 and June as we look forward and begin to scratch the surface of what the future of Hajichi might look like. For those who are unable to join us for part 1, we suggest going back and listening to it, since today's conversation is pretty much a direct continuation of part 1. But really, for those who haven't had a chance and still would like to go on with part 2, I'd like to reintroduce our guest panelists. 𝕍 Lewis is a second-generation mixed American 𝕍𝕏𝕚𝕤 from her Obachan, who immigrated to the US in the 50s. Her interest in Hajichi is heavily focused on decolonizing available resources on authentic practice history and a desire to see Hajichi revived and incorporated into modern 𝕍𝕏𝕚𝕤 culture. She is part of the group behind the new 𝕍𝕏𝕚𝕤 Hajichi Revival Project, collecting contemporary and historic family stories of Hajichi and multilingual Hajichi resources for 𝕍𝕏𝕚𝕤 exploring Hajichi. 𝕍 is based in New York City, where she attends medical school. June is a child of immigrants between a Japanese father and an Okinawan mother. Their grandmother was born and raised in 𝕃𝕚𝕚, infamously where the Enola Gay flew from. June's interest in DIY and stick and poke tattoos and their place in niche communities was piqued several years ago, despite their mother and grandmother's vehement objections. And because of their objections, was so excited and intrigued to learn that there was actually an Okinawan tradition of tattooing. In their professional life, June is a massage therapist and body worker, tarot mentor, and writer. So without any further delay, let's dive right into where we left off. We had talked about who was able to get the tattoos, the differences in the Hajichi patterns across the islands, and briefly touched on the idea that there were a community of people who tattooed each other, choosing symbols and images of things that were individual and perhaps non-traditional, and that perhaps this practice of tattooing was more social in comparison to the traditional or rigorous ones seen in Okinawa Honto or religious practices seen on Miyako. Laying that foundation, what do you think are the exceptions to what we may think of as Hajichi? Because when I think of Hajichi, the image that comes to mind is the classic hands of women with the tattoos that grow with them as they age.
One thing that I came across was that courtesan women didn't get Hajichi. They were limited in what they could get. So they would just get like 2 little dots on their, what does this say? The first phalanx of their middle finger on both hands, which I find really interesting. And I've only found the one reference to it, but that would mean that it was predetermined pretty early, because if you're getting tattoos at such a young age, then there would be some indication that these girls would grow up into kind of a preordained role for themselves if they were limiting what Hajichi they got when they were smaller.
I think that's interesting because the tattoo started so young, and what you're saying, like they were kind of already starting to be, girls were already starting to be put into different roles in society. Mm-hmm. And how much of that is Confucianism being imported in? How much of that is Okinawan culture? How much of that is class-based too? Mm-hmm. And does that have anything to do with how people call it a barbaric practice? And we call a lot of, even in our modern world, like hijabi women are like, oh, you're like giving into like a barbaric practice because you're being oppressed or whatever. And like, how does that relate to this, to Hajichi? That's kind of like my first thought. Like how like our gender roles are being codified and literally being branded on us. I think from like a revitalization standpoint, like a modern standpoint from where I am, it's like, well, I want to jump into like revitalization. I want to explore what Hajichi can mean for women-ish people. And like, how do we fit those two kind of opposing things? By we, I mean me, I guess. Like in my head, I'm like, well, it kind of sounds like a shitty practice and like my knee-jerk reaction, you know, but how much of that is colonialism and how much of that is internalized phobia to like indigenous culture?
Yeah, my brain definitely wants to go there, wants to go to the negative perspective and say, like, it could be read in that lens, if that's the lens you want to put over it. And there's like the idea of what Hilson was talking about, these women whose parents brought them in, got their full hands tattooed, breaking the ritual practice to ensure that they had what they felt was important culturally, with little meaning for the people getting them, who then pay the consequences of them for the rest of their lives, which was to be stuck in a famine and poverty-ridden Okinawa. And so you can see that as like a really repressive practice in that way. But I think in revitalizing dormant practices, recreating them for a modern world, we can bring them back to their pure roots, which is maybe a reinterpretation itself of what those roots are, because we're reading all of this through so many layers of history and change and layers of multiple colonizations of the land and the people. But I have a hard time denying the beauty of Hajichi, like the way that it marks these life-changing milestones for individuals, or the way that it could. And so when I think of what it could be for me and how we as a community can use them, our milestones don't have to be, you're a daughter, you've had puberty, you're bleeding now, so now we can marry you off, now you're married, now you've had a child, now your child's had a child. Those don't need to be what we get our Hajichi around, in my mind. Like, what are the big and significant moments in your life, for you, for us? And I think that that's where I see a lot of room for opportunity for Hajichi to grow. Does your finger need to get a tattoo when you get married? Is that going to be the line for you? Maybe it is. You know, I'm getting married next year and I'm kind of like, maybe I'll get my Hajichi first then.
Oh, I love that. Congratulations.
Thank you.
That's really interesting because I've, non-Shimanchu, non-indigenous people getting their ring finger tattooed when they get married.
I'm going to fall into that tradition.
Well, okay. We've talked about this before, Ko, about how, like, what makes Hajichi? Like, do my hand tattoos count as Hajichi because I said they are,
right?
Because they are kind of milestones for me, even though it wasn't specific. Well, yeah, there are some milestones. There weren't like specific dates to most of them, but there's always like a specific moment in time that I'm trying to capture when I do these tattoos. And does that make it Hajichi, or is it not Hajichi because it's not using the symbols? Or if we're going to be reinterpreting what milestones are and what important like cultural life moments, like these are so individual to me that how does that? Now I feel like I have like multiple thoughts. Thought streams.
That's okay. We'll get there.
But the idea of like Hajichi is cultural and there's a cultural meaning to it, and these have individual meaning to it. So does that? See, now I'm like, well, then that doesn't make it Hajichi because it's more individual rather than like a group message.
Yeah.
And then how do we create those new images for us, for our generation? Like, do we have what if we got like a Shimanchu online that we're the online diaspora? Like we should get like a tattoo for when we meet up or something. Like, you know, like what kind of cool new cultural events can we create with Hajichi? That was like 10,000 different thoughts. I'm sorry.
No, I'm there with it.
I'm just even thinking like talking about the variety between the islands, like there was already, and then what I've learned through this conversation is that a lot of it was kind of, there wasn't a whole lot of ceremony or ritual around it. Like it was just a thing that you did. And coming up from the spiritual lens that I do is like, there's nothing more spiritual than like our intrinsic knowing of what needs to happen. Right. And so this is a very sort of chaotic approach to what, Hajichi could be or anything like that. And it's my own personal perspective. But yeah, I think it really depends on who the individual is and like why you're choosing to do this thing. And of course, if it has significance to you, then I think that's completely valid. Like, I think that's absolutely valid, if not one of the most validating things that there are. Whereas, I mean, if you use that example of, the young women that had it done to them, like, and they didn't have any choice, like, was that Hajichi? Like, if you got it done to you and you weren't, and I mean, like at that point it's a brand, or maybe that's going too far, but it's like the intentionality behind it.
That story was kind of, I wouldn't say heartbreaking, but it like really, like you got this important, I mean, in retrospect to us, this important cultural thing done to you, rather than you got to know that this meant this, and you got to experience that moment in your life, and you got that tattooed on you. And that's I don't know, it just seems such a, I don't want to say shame or like,
right.
It sucks.
I have a quick question. I mean, not everybody got Hajichi though, right?
Yes.
So
well, I take a little issue with the description of these as like forced brandings, because a lot of women themselves went out and sought Hajichi. Like there's that Taiwanese Okinawan museum piece that came up, and there were so many stories of women who were like, oh yeah, I found the lady who could do it, and like went to her house and we just like banged it out so that I could have them because they wanted them. That doesn't mean that there are not stories of coercion, but the overwhelming majority of the stories that I hear are people saying like, I did this thing. I'm getting married. I made a fucking baby and I got my tattoo for it. Like I earned my piece. So I suppose that's important. But I think the piece of coercion or potential for it comes in when you start thinking like, yeah, every person got these. Every woman, every female-born child was tattooed as she grew up. And from what I can tell, pre-1900, that was the case. That if you were female-born, you were tattooed as you aged. So then that does start becoming like, well, is it a choice if you have to get it? If you're destined to have them?
That's like with any, I feel like as like a Asian American child of immigrants, like there's like a commonality that I've talked to with other like second generation kids that are like this idea that tradition especially is bad, and like anything that could be forced and isn't like individualistic or independent, like a lashing back at the fact that their parents wanted tradition and like rules and strictness and stuff. So what was my point? I guess that's kind of decolonizing, where I'm trying to remember that not all traditions, not all cultural traditions, anything that's old or whatever, that doesn't necessarily mean it's bad just because there was a cultural expectation for me to do that thing, like get tattooed or whatever. Yeah, it's been a struggle for me to think about things like that. With whether it's like, is it branding, or is like, if it was it forced, if it's everybody doing it.
I want to talk about two. So we talked about like what the tattoos looked like on Okinawa Honto and how they have a uniformity across the island. But I wanted to talk about Amami and the island we talked about with Hilson a little bit more, Miyako. So on Amami, what I've seen is that the back of the hand was very individual. And so there's this one quote from an interview of a Hajichi, a woman who tattooed. She's explaining like what all the different pieces mean to this person interviewing her. And then she's like, I can't tell you what goes on the back of the hand because everybody gets whatever they want. It's too different for me to explain it, to like give you a few images. So like there's a piece of like huge individuality and like one of the biggest pieces on the hand there. And then in Miyako, there's the idea that these tattoos carry you through the afterlife, but also that you would collect them as you built skill. So as you learned to weave a cloth, whenever you learned to weave a new pattern, you could get the tattoo for that pattern. And so they were saying, this one ethnographer was saying, like, there were only a few women in town who had them down to their elbows because they were the only ones who had like built enough skill to be able to say like, yeah, I got them all.
Nice.
Like a Girl Scout pouch.
Yes, exactly.
I was thinking Pokemon gym badges, but that's okay.
But I think those are really good ways to kind of like help us understand the nuance of what these tattoos were, just than what they were on Okinawa Honto. And then there's that quote that we were talking about with the grandma who was saying like her and her friends just tattooed each other. Mm-hmm. So like they were covered in tattoos at that point down their hands and arms, but it was the images that they were interested in that they wanted. They did them to themselves and each other rather than going to a hajichi to individuals who just tattooed. And so maybe there is a place in this narrative, in this history, for you to carve out for yourself and enjoy that culture, be a part of it, revitalize it in a way that fits your lifestyle and your own interest.
Yeah. And that's generally how I go anyway. Like, how do I make Hajichi mine? Is kind of how I've been coming at this.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's so important when we talk about something that was so structured around what the role of a woman is: to marry, to produce children, to ensure that they are healthy into the next life so that they can bear more children. And I think and hope that we all see women as significantly more valuable than that. And also as someone, at least for myself, I'll say, not predetermined in their life based on the sex that they're born into. And so breaking Hajichi from this archaic idea of gender and gender roles is really important to me. I think that's just something to, like, as we decide what are our meaningful moments to get Hajichi and to build them, if that's how you want to approach Hajichi, that we can unpack and explore.
Yeah, I think that's a privilege of our time, right? Where, you know, we are afforded these like equality, like there's a quality of life that we have that our ancestors did not have. And so the ability to make a choice and the ability to have the individuality to say, like, this is what I want to do. And I can make it mine. I have the choice to make it mine, or it's easier to make that choice, or I don't have as much stacked against me trying to make that choice, is like incredibly powerful to me. So just hearing you, and I'm just so excited about the revival project too. And something you said earlier, Ko, around talking with other, you know, Hajichiya and like their experience in Okinawa versus like maybe the perspective that you or we have here. I don't know, could you speak to that a little bit? I imagine they probably have a very different, you know, I completely resonate with what you just said, but I don't know if you've had a chance to talk to anybody over there around something like that and like making it their own, or do they have feelings around tradition? And yeah.
I'll share what I know, but I want to preface it with the fact that I don't think I've had enough in-depth conversations with any of these individuals to speak to what their philosophy is behind it. So I've got one of them lined up for an interview as an FYI that like I'm really looking forward to unpacking some stuff with. But to answer your question a bit more, for the most part, what I'm seeing is people tattooing full hands or full components of hands. So like all the fingers. So not following kind of the lifespan or timeline of traditional Hajichi. And my assumption is that these are individuals who are aware of what that timeline could be if they wanted to follow it. So there's the divergence there already from tradition, recreating it in a different way. I see lots of people tattooing the smaller wrist pieces that someone might have gotten in a design, which makes sense, right? Like my tattoos stop at my wrist. And like I went as far as I was comfortable when I got it. And I was like, that's where I'm going to draw the line, which in a way is really nice because now my hands are open for Hajichi. But at the time was like, I can hide this in a long sleeve if I need to. And God knows I spent every 100-degree day in Florida with full long sleeves on when I went to go visit my Okinawan grandma. So I think like that is what I'm finding is really interesting, is most of the tattoos that people are recreating, they're not putting on their hands. Mm-hmm. So these are people calling themselves Hajichi. They're tattooing imagery from Hajichi, but not in a very traditional method. Or I shouldn't say method, not in a very traditional placement or order. Mm-hmm. One of these practitioners has been like experimenting with recreating the traditional methods and inks, which is really impressive to me. But the technique of tattooing is also something that I haven't been able to completely parse out. Depending on the island, people are using anywhere from 2 to 10 needles at a time placed into a stick and using those to tattoo, right? So like just pretty common if you look at tattoos from the general area, exactly, like lining up a bunch of needles together. Or sometimes they say like a thorn of a metal needle couldn't be found. And June and I were talking at one point about like what that means for the quality of tattoos, right? If you're using a pretty blunt instrument, you're going to get bigger, bleedy tattoos. And so when we look at, this book goes into kind of like the class differences of tattoos, and the further you get away from Shuri and Okinawa, the bigger the tattoos get. And how much of that is just about resource availability? Like if you are using blunt tools, you're going to cover more area than if you're using a very thin, fine iron needle. Anyways, that's all rambly. But
do you know much about the methods? Like, is it more like a hammering, or is it kind of like how we hand poke? And
it's hand poke. It's hand poke, but I find this really interesting. From almost all the descriptions I've read, and I'm sure it was different based on practitioner, they would paint the design on first. So they would take the ink, mix it in the paste, so 𝕼𝕚𝕚𝕚 and charcoal, put it onto the hand where the design was going to be, and then they'd stab through the ink kind of diagonally with their like stick with needles tied to the end to push the ink into the hand rather than like putting the needles in ink.
Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Wow.
And then they wash it with alcohol to sterilize and then wrap in the silk cloth.
Wow.
What you thinking?
Maybe I'm going to start experimenting.
Let me know how it goes.
Yeah. I mean, I could just, so like going back to like the whole like social aspect of like, of tattooing each other and stuff like that I really like about tattoo culture is that like, and then your talk about like how it could be kind of like individual little pieces up and down the arm. My friend who's done a lot of my stick and pokes, like his whole left leg is pretty much dedicated to him poking himself as practice. And like, I have a leg that's dedicated to just him practicing on me, you know? So it's like, so it's like a very social, like, I love that social aspect of tattooing. I kind of forgot my point of that, but.
No, I love that too.
But yeah, I have a leg that I practice tattooing. so I can do that with
your Hajichi technique.
Yeah.
That is awesome.
Very interesting.
I think, Mariko, to get a little more to what your question was, I see a lot of practitioners tattooing things that I would not have looked at and considered have any connection to Hajichi, calling them Hajichi, or at least hashtagging Hajichi, which like, what does that mean to you? Is that just who you want to attract? But it's such an abstract thing to tag a photo with if you don't know what it is. So I'm really, if you're listening, I'd love to know. Let's talk about it. Why these artists call these pieces Hajichi, what it means to them. Is it that I, as a Shimanshi person, putting ink into someone's body and creating Hajichi? Is it that this person's intention behind the piece is Hajichi? Is it the technique itself that you're using? I think there's so many ways that someone could say this tattoo is a piece of Hajichi. I don't know that I would agree with all of them, but none of us are going to own this word or what it means, what it becomes in the future. And that's just the nature of being a diasporic community. And that's both really powerful and a little scary. Like, what will Hajichi be? Will I love it? Will I be like, that's not what I would have done? Time will tell.
There's already, I mean, we've talked about this in previous conversations, but like, regardless of whether my current hand tattoos are Hajichi, if I got something that was more traditional as a, not actually, like as a non-binary person, am I allowed to get, I mean, I'm allowing myself to do it, but but as a group of people, like, do we count that as Hajichi if the person isn't a woman?
I would, but I think there are going to be people in our community who say, no, this is a female practice. You only get this if you're a woman. And my question for that kind of rhetoric is always, why? Why is this specific to gender to you? Is it about having a womb? Is it about the marriage and children you've produced? How deep are you getting back to what the origin of these tattoos were? And then at that point, do we want to go back to the folklore and the story of what made Hajichi a thing? Because that wasn't about having children. That was about protecting yourself from an outsider trying to harm you and to hurt what was important to you. If that's the case, then anything can be Hajichi. It's the protective omens for you. Mm-hmm. So for folks who want to say Hajichi is this feminine thing that only women can have, I want to have that conversation of why that's the case for you. What does being a woman mean to you? What are you trying to peg us women with to say that this is our practice? It's got a lot of baggage.
Mm-hmm. A lot of baggage.
Yeah.
And I know when we did our prep talk with Tilson too, like I had asked, like, is there a tradition of like men getting tattooed? Like, have you seen any of that being referenced? And I think he pretty much said no, right? And
he said no, but there is. We talked about it briefly, so I'll just share what it is again. The name I've heard for male tattooing in Okinawa is umagura. And it was isolated to a fishing community, although it's really unclear if it was isolated to a fishing community or if it was a practice amongst coastal individuals. But they were these kind of trident and staff-like tattoos that they would get either on their right or left arm near the elbow. And that trident exists in more typical Hajichi tattoo style in women's hands as well. You'll see it in some women's, I want to say, Amami Island is where I've seen the same trident on women's hands, but it might be Miyako. But it looks like a classic little 3-pronged trident, and they were kind of like warding pieces that men would get to protect them when they were out fishing. So that history exists. And I think the thing that we have to remember about Hajichi is that what we are looking at is, I don't want to say the end, but the point at which Hajichi went dormant, when we lost a lot of its history. And there has to have been tattoo practice prior to that. There's so much about Okinawan culture and history that we know we've lost. Like, you can look at anthropologic sites and see that there's just such a rich history of what Okinawan religion was like alone. So I can't imagine that there weren't more types of tattoo that eventually evolved into what we're familiar with, which is Hajichi hand tattoos for women. And to that point as well, there's also a history of therapeutic tattooing in the Ryukyuan Islands that I've seen referenced in a few pieces of kind of like global therapeutic tattooing history. So like, how has tattoo been used as treatment? So we talk a lot about how these will protect your soul and your spirit, protect your future generations of your family, like by expanding the tattoo, or just by being able to pass you into the afterlife. But there was also for like arthritic pain, joint pain, you would get tattoos around your point of pain. So like these little just dots of tattoo ink, same color as Hajichi, same color as these tattoo histories that we're talking about, but they would encircle your point of pain to attempt to heal you. And I've seen those on shoulder, knee, and ankle or elbow. I can't remember which one it was, somebody's joint. But
who was doing the actual tattooing of those?
No idea.
Healers, priestesses?
Right? I have no idea. I would love to know. Right? I would assume, since it's therapeutic, that they would have been individuals who were treating for medicine. I'm starting
so much of like medicine and spiritual is like overlaps when it comes to.
Yes, absolutely. There's this great photo that I keep telling Mariko I'm going to find, and I'm sorry I haven't found it yet, but it's of a woman who had her knee encircled with the dot hat tattoos, and then, because it was more recent, had knee surgery. So she has the surgical line with the staple marks down her knee, and then it's encircled with these older tattoos. And I just love that image, like the past and the present being combined in this human. I find it really beautiful.
Yeah.
Amazing. It's like, it's a rite of passage, right? I mean, like the whole thing is just like things that are happening to your body in a permanent way. And yeah. And it's like, a surgical scar. There's nothing, that's pretty modern.
Yes, exactly. Especially knee surgeries. Those are very intense.
Yeah.
But I think the whole point of that is that, like, are those Hajichi? Who decides if they are or aren't? Is it our decision at this point as the newest generation? Often those types of tattoos are referenced in literature about Hajichi because people are saying, the Okinawan Islands had a history of tattoo. It included this. It was called Hajichi. But is that just our rewriting of history, categorizing all forms of body ink into Hajichi? And also the word Hajichi is, it's also just one sliver of what these tattooing practices were. There's a breakdown of them in this book, and there's so many names for it. Do we want me to flip to them?
Yeah, Go for it.
Okay, it's going to take just a second, but then I can read them out.
Well, how about while you look, that kind of reminds me of how we were talking about how we start documenting these cultural practices, right? And we only get these snapshots of what's happening. We can't turn back time. We won't be able to see all the things that we've lost. And I think I had written this down not mad, but like passionate about it earlier. It was because we have this Western ideal of like documentation as making something permanent. Like, oh, we're saving this, we're preserving this for the future, but you're not really, you're just preserving this one tiny sliver. You can try to fit in as much context as you can, but it's always going back to my objectivity rant. Like there's always going to be that bias from someone. So what have we lost? Mm-hmm. And that ties into just oral histories in general too, like how like Western views of history means things have to be written down. Things have to be codified into this one unchanging thing. And that's what's true culture or whatever. But then you look at oral histories and you have different versions being recorded, right? And that's a snapshot. But what you don't see is how they've changed through that time and how people have passed it on orally, and how just because it's changing doesn't make it less historical, I guess.
Right. The oral tradition embodies and regenerates change every time there's a new generation telling the history. And so when we start writing things down in these permanent formats and say, this one is the real thing, we stop that tradition of change. We stop allowing our own histories to evolve with us. And which one of those is more valuable? Hard to say. But
we like there's been like anthropological studies of like Aboriginal histories of like a certain island that used to that was above sea level, at one point, and they're still talking about it now, but it doesn't exist anymore. It's not there anymore. Or like, it's just so, sorry, that's totally a tangent, but
it's a good one. It's good to remember that when we're exploring history.
Just like the idea that like, as revitalizing it now, I don't think there's like a way to define Hajichi in one way, because it's going to be different between different generations.
And different islands. It's kind of the whole point we were getting at through all of this was like, well, I can't say it was just this way, because if you look here, or here, it was different in all of them. And so you're trying to like consolidate a varied practice, which is a bit of a problem, or a kind of the problem with trying to say 𝕼𝕬𝕟𝕬 culture is this one thing, because inherently by being a nation of islands, or a spread of islands, there are unique cultures within it. We might share a lot of similarities and solidarity, but there's unique history to each of those places. I have that list if you want to hear it.
Would love to. Yeah.
Okay. I'm not going to be able to specify these to the islands because I can't read the kanji for all these islands, but we can share this as a snapshot at the end as well. So Hajichi and Hazaki are both Okinawa Island. There's also Hazuchi, Hazuki, Ayahazuki, Hanzuki, Teanzuki, Hanjichi, Ayahanjichi, Panjiki, Haizutsu, Pizutsuku, Pazutsuku, Paitsuki, Teitsuku, Paratsuku. All very different.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
But it's kind of, you can kind of hear the similarities.
There's a thread, right? Yeah. And it breaks down the further away you get.
Wow.
So it's being so similar. Like Paratsuku, would you ever think that's the same thing as Hajichi? So, and then the question is begged, are they the same thing? The practice is different. The reason you get them is different. The aesthetic is different. They just both happen to be on your hands. But then one starts going all the way down the arm. And so is it even really the same anymore? I think there's just, I'm down to see us embrace it as a global community that has been forced into solidarity and probably had much solidarity in our history as well. But I think our attempt to say like, it's this one thing, it is Hajichi, is a little erroneous from the very beginning. We already know it wasn't just Hajichi.
I pulled out the Okinawan English word book and looked up Hajichi, and just because I'm wondering if like the roots, like if that's why they sound differently, you know, between the different languages.
Is it in there? Is the word in there?
No, it is. Yeah, Hajichi. Okay. So it says Hajichi is the roots would be in Japanese would be hari and tsuki, and hari would be the needle, and tsuki is like
yes, it's often translated as needle stick, and the tattooers as needle stickers.
Okay. Yeah. So I kind of wonder if all those different words were, you know, that island's version of hari and tsuki or ha.
Right. Needle and stick.
Yeah. And I also heard like a te in there, which is hand. So
te hanzuki, which was from the same island that uses hanzuki. So maybe there's something there. Hand like or needle. Is
like specifically hand.
Maybe. Yeah. That's so interesting.
I need to, because I have a linguistics degree, so I feel like I need to like, maybe I'll start studying Okinawan linguistics somehow.
Yeah. There's a whole community that wants you to do so.
Yeah. Yeah.
Have we just kind of inherently wrapped up our Hajichi conversation? Did that happen? Mariko, I appreciate you reaching out so much. This is like such an honor. And I definitely don't think I'm an authority on Hajichi in any way, but I'm excited to see what comes of this. And I hope people reach out.
Yeah.
Very, very open to have these conversations with more individuals.
Yeah, me too. I'm really excited. Thank you both so much for your time.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I feel silly since I don't have a PhD. And I'm not.
I don't either.
I'm not scrolling through Instagram every day looking at either. So,
no.
I don't know.
No, I appreciate your perspective so much.
Yeah, I really did. Like in the beginning, like I'm just like, this is so cool. Like it will speak to so many demographics. And I think that is exactly what you were saying, Ko, around like you can't boil it down to one experience. Like there's not one like target demographic or something like that. So Ko, and June, I really think your perspective, even if you might not have felt it, I'm sure that people will resonate with your story about like, you know, like your neighbor downstairs. Like I was like, wow, good for you. Like, that's amazing. And I know there are people that are going to get it though. Like they're going to be like, no, I've been that person. Like, and I know I have friends that have like, you know, I'm like, tell me about your tattoos. And they're like, yeah, this kind of happened.
Yeah. I also think any conversation about Hajichi, because it is so historically gendered today, requires a dive into that piece. And I don't think he'll center myself or the individuals to talk about how complex that is or the ways that it should be approached. Like I identify as a cisgender woman. I also identify as queer, but I'm marrying a cis guy. So like, I think it's just so important.
Well, we don't want to erase. We
don't. But I also this is a whole separate tangential conversation, but I think it's so important to recognize the privilege that I have being in a heteronormative couple and like the fact that will present me to the world as a straight woman for the rest of my life, hopefully, right? But
them Hajichis.
That aside, I just think it's so important when we talk about Hajichi to talk about queering the future of Hajichi as well. Like it will not be the recreation of the female norm that was expected in Okinawa. There's no reason for it to be. And so I really cherish your perspective and thoughts there.
Whoa. Let's clear the future. Clear the future, please.
I love it.
Thanks for joining us for part 2 on this topic of Hajichi. Even though we just scratched the surface level of the future of Hajichi, I'm so curious about what others think about what you might consider as milestones.
I personally am very interested in getting my own Hajichi and have been considering what those milestones might look like for me. We had so much great feedback and discussion from part 1 and would love to keep the conversation going, so please drop us a DM on Instagram or send us an email at 𝕼𝕡𝕚𝕚@gmail.com. We would also love it if you could rate and review us on Apple Podcasts so we can reach more of our 𝕼𝕡𝕚𝕚 Choodee. Again, a big 𝕵𝕚𝕚𝕚 debutu to our guest speakers, Ko, who helps run 𝕼𝕡𝕚𝕚 Hajichi Revival. You can find them on Instagram at 𝕼𝕡𝕚𝕚 Hajichi, or you can send them an email at hajichirevival@gmail.com. You can also find June on Instagram at 𝕼𝕝𝕝𝕝 or on mastodon.design/@𝕼𝕝𝕝𝕝. All these links you can find in the show notes. Thank you again to Brandon Ng for providing today's music. You can find him on Instagram at _sing_uchinaguchi or on Bandcamp at brandonng.bandcamp.com. Thank you to our production team, 𝕁𝕦𝕟𝕬, and to Joseph Camio for their amazing audio editing skills. Also, a big thank you to V, who has donated to support the podcast on Ko-fi. Your generosity helps keep the Stream podcast going. If you enjoyed our podcast, we'd appreciate if you hit subscribe on our channels. We're on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and we'd love it if you shared this with your friends and family. And of course, donations via Ko-fi are graciously appreciated. Until next time, mata yasai!
And for the Okinawan fun fact for the month, we are super excited to announce that we will be collaborating with 𝕵𝕨𝕚𝕚 for the panel Authors in Conversation with Elizabeth Miki Brina, author of Speak Okinawa, and Akemi Johnson, author of Night in the American Village. I will be pulling this from the 𝕵𝕨𝕚 website, but between August 29th through September 25th, the Japanese American Memorial Pilgrimages, otherwise known as JAMP, in partnership with the National Park Service, will co-host 𝕵𝕨𝕚, a community virtual pilgrimage. This pilgrimage will run continuously for 4 weeks with new content provided daily. The pilgrimage is free and open to the public and will be available online. Some of the videos will be live. They will allow for community engagement and questions. Other ones will be pre-recorded. Due to COVID-19, most of the organized annual pilgrimages to the Japanese American World War II incarceration sites were canceled in 2020. 𝕵𝕨𝕚 was developed in an effort to provide a safe space for the Japanese, Okinawan, and Ainu American community and allies to learn, communicate, and collaborate as they normally would during pilgrimages. 𝕵𝕨𝕚 focuses on Japanese, Okinawan, and Ainu American history from 1800s to today. They do have a YouTube where you can find these videos. We will provide it in the show notes, but it is also under JAM Pilgrimages. Last year, they also held a talk in search of incarcerated Okinawans, a conversation on decolonizing Japanese America with Sho Yamaguchi and Joseph Camio, if you guys want to check it out. This year, they will also have a panel with Sho and Ako called Finding Each Other Again, an online gathering for people with Okinawan ancestry affected by World War II incarceration on September 12th at 3 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. We will include the links to these panels in the show notes.